Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
We're really excited about all of that. I was saying to Michelle that Teresa of Avila is someone that my wife, Mary, wrote her undergraduate thesis on at the University of Dallas, all in Spanish. And Mary often likes to point out that whenever somebody says that the Catholic Church doesn't produce strong women, it's just an indication they've never read or studied St. Teresa of Avila. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Father Steve, who's going to say a few words and I think introduce our speaker. But again, I'm so grateful that you all have joined us today, and I'm so grateful that you guys are a part of our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here this evening and those who are joining us by Zoom. I'm Stephen Payne. I'm the chair of the Center for Carmelite Studies. Melissa is the program manager. And this event, this annual lecture in Carmelite Studies, we've been doing it now this is our fifth lecture. And just so you know, although we're a few years behind in the publishing, we do publish them in this book form with CUA Press. So we have this one from Keith Egan. The first one is already available. The second one is in press now, I think, for St. Teresa and St. Joseph. That has beautiful illustrations and so on. And this talk this evening will also appear as a volume in this series. And we have at the back there, we have Michelle Jones's book, The Gospel Mysticism of Ruth Burrows, at a special discount for $10 if you'd like to buy a copy. And also the CUA Press, Catholic University of America Press, has some of these Carmelite-related volumes as well there. So you're most welcome. And you see there's food back there after we've talked. There will be an opportunity after the lecture for some questions and answers before we turn to the food. But let me introduce our speaker of the evening. We were really delighted when we found out that Michelle Jones was going to be here in the States. It's time when we usually have our lecture, and so immediately we asked her, would she be willing to give the annual lecture on Ruth Burrows, who died about a year ago now. So she's still very fresh, I think, in many people's memories. And our speaker herself, Michelle Jones, is a consecrated woman affiliated with the Carmelite Monastery of Quidnam in the UK, which is where Ruth Burrows was. Wendy Beckett was there too. She lives a contemplative life in the foothills of the Prongbrook Range. Did I say it right? That's it. Okay. An ancient mountain range in the great southern region of Western Australia. From her home in Prongbrook, Michelle works as a lecturer in theology for BBI, Broken Bay Institute, the Australian Institute of Theological Education. She also helps the Carmelites in England at Boris Hill. She works on the Carmelite Press there that they have, let's see. She handles the website and social media for the Discalced Carmelites in Australia. She did her doctorate in theology and has a licentiate in theology from the Angelicum in Rome. She has a master's of theology from the University of Notre Dame, Australia. She's currently writing a book on Wendy Beckett, which I'm sure will be as wonderful as this one too, which also certainly got noticed by the Catholic Press Association a couple of years ago when it came out. We got some nice awards for this book. So you can pick up a copy for $10 at the end. So thank you and welcome, Michelle. We're very happy to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, Father Stephen, for that very warm welcome. And thank you to the community here at the Catholic University of America for the very warm welcome, and the community of Friars at White Friars Hall for the generous hospitality that you're experiencing. Thrilled to be here with you all. It's a great delight and a great honour. So is a view. And I'm sorry to be over here to the right for the people in the room. I'm over to the far right, but it gives me access to my slides. It's not that I want to be behind a big thing. obituary, he wrote,
He wrote for Ruth Burrows that was published in the tablet exactly 1 year ago today. How about that?
Jesuit priest and Chancellor of Seattle University, Steve Sonberg, claimed that Ruth Burrows
can justifiably be considered a Teresa of Avila of our era.
Now, at first glance, this may seem to be a generously intended yet wildly exaggerated statement.
Saint Teresa, she travelled the length and breadth of Spain, establishing reformed Carmelite monasteries. She enjoyed a rich panoply of mystical phenomena.
And of course, she was the first woman to be declared a doctor of the church. Ruth Burrows, on the other hand, left home at 18 to join a Carmelite monastery.
And she remained with that community for the next 8 decades of her life.
She experienced God as hidden from her throughout her life, right until her death.
And many people don't know her name. It was Rachel Gregory.
Ruth Burrows is a pen name. However, despite this apparent audacity of Sonderberg's claim, I want to align myself
with Stephen Sonderberg's claim throughout this presentation. This claim could be expanded in many directions, and there's
ideas for PhD theses if you're looking for it. Can justifiably considered a Teresa of Avila of our era. Explain. So it can be taken in many directions, but today, this evening, I want to make the case that Ruth Burrows is a Teresa of Avila of our era, in that Ruth Burrows,
like Saint Teresa, is an authoritative
teacher of the meaning of prayer, and one who is much needed for our times. Now, in presenting Ruth Burrows as a compelling articulator of the meaning of prayer,
I need to make 2 points clear
from the outset. The first is that Burrows, like the great Carmelite teachers of prayer before her, doesn't see prayer as one isolated dimension of life. Rather, in her words, prayer is life itself. For Ruth Burrows, prayer is a way of being. You see, Burrows' pages are steeped in the truth that we have a God who relentlessly, passionately offers God's self in total love
to each one of us
throughout every moment
of our existence. And from our side,
the fundamental task of being human
is to hold out empty hands to God's self-gift.
First and last, we must let ourselves be loved. So when Burrows speaks of prayer, she has the whole unfolding of this lifelong and all-encompassing relationship of love in view. So this unfolding, the unfolding of this love relationship, includes, of course, the times we set aside for silent prayer.
And every other second of our lives as well. As she writes,
we are truly alive, truly human,
only when our whole life is prayer. Prayer is the very air we breathe. So that's my first preliminary point.
My second preliminary point
is that the heart of Ruth Burrows' teaching on prayer
runs sheer contrary to human wisdom and our unrelenting desire to achieve.
and to be in control.
For Burrows, the whole gamut,
Of our interior not enoughness,
the experience of not being able to perform well spiritually,
our fearful vulnerability before the unfolding of life, our inescapable sense of simply not being radiantly virtuous,
all of this is fertile ground.
is in fact the only ground for spiritual growth.
She wants us to know
That all the messiness, fears, fragility,
unpredictability, brokenness, everything that we tend to dismiss
as obstacles to spiritual growth
are in fact the very contexts that growth.
In her words, human poverty is a deep mystery
That plunges us
into Trinitarian depths.
with Saint Teresa of Avila. Burrows' teaching on prayer emerged from her lived experience. So let's turn now to get to know Ruth Burrows so that we can appreciate how her life is the seedbed for the teaching on prayer that she sets before us throughout her writings.
Here she is.
Rachel Gregory was born in England on the 18th of August 1923. Whoops. As I mentioned, I said Rachel Gregory there. As I mentioned, Ruth Burrows is a pen name, but I'll continue to use Ruth Burrows here so we don't get confused.
She was the third of 7 children.
Family life was shaped by the beliefs and practices of the Catholic faith, and Ruth and her siblings attended Catholic primary and secondary schools. Ruth experienced a spiritual awakening on a school retreat when she was 17 years old.
She came to know in a way that she couldn't possibly unknow
That God exists and that it's possible to be intimate.
with God. She also knew in this moment of grace
That she was called to respond to that revelation by becoming an enclosed nun.
she didn't quite know what brand to start with, but she knew she had to be an enclosed nun. Soon after her 18th birthday, on the 8th of September 1941,
Ruth joined the community, the Carmelite community, with whom she would spend the next 82 years. And she turned down a place at Oxford in order to become a nun. Ruth served her community, the community of the Quidnam Carmelite Monastery, over many decades as prioress and as novice mistress. And as prioress, she played a pivotal and groundbreaking role in reforming the monastery in response to the directives of the Second Vatican Council. In fact, it's been said that Ruth, this is a quote, has done more than any other one person for the Teresian nuns in England during the post-Vatican II period.
so Ruth Burrows came to be known beyond her monastery's walls
Through her writings. Her first book and autobiography, Before the Living God, was published in 1975.
In addition to adopting a pen name at that time, Ruth altered dates
Within her life story and mixed up names and personalities of other people. These veils of obscurity
freed Ruth to write with exceptional frankness.
Ruth came to write over a dozen other books and many articles on the Christian life in general and the Carmelite tradition in particular.
One of her final books, Love Unknown, was commissioned by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams.
Burrows died on the 10th of November last year, aged 100,
and she spent her final years bedridden
and away from her beloved community in a care home in London, receiving many visits from her sisters who took the most beautiful care of her. So that's a bit of a sketch, but let's delve a little deeper
into the story of Ruth Burrows. Perhaps unexpectedly for a nun,
reforming leader and spiritual writer, by temperament,
Ruth knew only the raw fragility
of the human condition.
She wouldn't use these words, but from her earliest childhood, she was visibly aware of the ontological chasm between God and humankind and the fearful
reality of humanity's inescapable contingency. She experienced within herself only emptiness.
From childhood, her interior landscape didn't offer her
any comforting, secure emotional supports upon which to establish a relationship with God, or any reassuring awareness of her own stockpile of virtue and goodness. In her autobiography, Ruth relates, says, often I have complained in my heart
that God seemed absent from my life. It seemed to me that I had to live life all alone, eating it.
in its raw bitterness. He was not there to give me understanding and comfort.
Even now, I can sympathise with myself over this.
A hidden God he has been to me, but God indeed. And in Love Unknown, Ruth tells us how she appraised herself during her early years as a Carmelite. She says, I felt I was a sham, pretending to be something I was not. I lacked a natural religious sense and feared I was an agnostic, if not an atheist at heart. Love her candour, it's so encouraging. Certainly, Ruth had had that conversion experience on her school retreat that set her on a relentless pursuit of intimacy with God.
However, the spiritual practices with which she was presented during her monastic formation
didn't seem to facilitate that intimacy.
Rather, they seemed to keep her deepest self exiled from the living God. Looking around at her life in Carmel, Ruth's inner being cried out, this is for others, not for me. Others can drink of this fountain.
But it is barred to me. He is the God of others. He loves them, they please him, are dear to him.
But I am outcast, cut off from him.
He cares nothing for me. So,
what happened?
How did this young Carmelite, shrouded in darkness and experiencing only emptiness,
within,
become a Saint Teresa of Avila of our times? What happened was that Ruth came to understand
that her desolate
interior landscape, this nothingness that seemed to cry out failure
at every turn,
was the very place where Jesus made his home and opened her out
into his surrender to the Father's outpoured love.
This world remaking discovery
was largely facilitated by Ruth's persistent meditation on the Gospels and the writings of Saint Therese of Lisieux.
Ruth came to realise that her task was not to try to escape her lack of spiritual success, but rather to accept it
and hold it before God with trust.
And Ruth gradually began to realise
that her personal discovery, this discovery that made meaning of her nothingness,
was actually expressing a universal truth. None of us, no matter what our temperament or spiritual background or psychological makeup, none of us in any measure
is the way, the truth,
and the life. None of us can achieve,
charm,
or spirit our way into union with the living God.
We are all essentially little children. We are all taken into the Trinitarian depths.
In and through Jesus. What's more,
Ruth came to understand that the universal truth she had found written in her own life is at the heart of the Carmelite mystical tradition. The writings of Teresa and John of the Cross and others
don't run parallel to the gospel, or they don't soar above the gospel.
Rather, they are a glorious expression of the innermost meaning of the gospel.
Ruth states this very clearly on the first page of her book, Guidelines for Mystical Prayer, when she writes, I'll bring this up here. Life-changing. When she writes, mystical life, infused contemplation.
These things mean absolutely nothing unless they mean Jesus and his life in us.
Jesus, who alone brings God and humanity together.
Jesus, our holiness. It's no surprise that this ceramic, called the Merciful Trinity,
created by the Swiss Dominican nun, Sister Caritas Muller, meant so much to Ruth. She found a picture of it in a magazine, and I remember the enthusiasm and reverence
that she displayed as she showed this picture to me
during one of my visits. And she came to write about this profoundly moving image in her book, Extravagant Love.
She writes,
can we believe that God comes so close?
He's so bound up with us, as this image reveals.
See how of the 4 connecting circles, the centre one is the focus of the other 3. Within that circle lies each one of us.
Help us.
The divine Trinity comes down to our aid.
The Father,
gently lifting us up and tenderly pressing his holy face against our leprous cheek. The Son kneels to kiss our dirty, crippled feet.
delighting in being our servant. And as a dove inflames the spirit, mutual love of Father and Son swoops down to complete our enfolding into the unspeakable glory of the triune life.
It goes on, this image powerfully summarises the mystery of the incarnation. Who could have dreamed that the creator of the universe, too great for any created mind to comprehend, would choose to become defenceless as a slave, totally immersed in our feverish, suffering existence, yearning humbly for our love, prepared to expend himself to win it. So loved are we.
So loved.
Shall we be his joy and delight?
Or shall we break his heart? So as I mentioned earlier, Ruth Burrows' lived experience is the seedbed
for the teaching on prayer that she presents throughout her writings.
we have seen that Burrows discovered in her own life
The gospel, mystical truth, that we're drawn into union with the living God,
inasmuch as we allow Jesus
to say his yes
to the Father's love
through the raw truth of our lives. So let's see how this fundamental insight,
is developed in her teaching on prayer.
and to return to what I said in my introduction, what we're looking at here is the unfolding of our relationship with God
Throughout all dimensions of our lives, including but not limited to those times specifically devoted to silent prayer.
for Burrows.
Throughout every dimension of our lives,
In our every encounter with the poverty of our innermost selves,
we are called to choose to trust
in God's outpoured love, rather than flee from our poverty. She would have us stand in our naked neediness with empty hands
rather than having comforting recourse
to our own attempts at self-perfection and control. As Burrows puts it,
It's a matter of trustingly choosing
to become at the root of your being a little child. This was the last thing she said to me in our last meeting. She said, remember, we're just little children. And the more I think about Ruth Burrows' spirituality, the more I get what she was trying to say to me. Trust.
is the key word here.
This trust isn't something that we have to muster up in our own strength. Rather, we are enabled to trust.
As Jesus stretches out his surrender to the Father's love within our lives, our trust
Is a participation in the very trust of Jesus in the Father. Burrows writes in Love Unknown, nothing so glorifies God, so pleases him as our trust. It is a practical avowal that we have absolutely nothing as of ourselves, that everything, whatsoever it may be, is all from him, is all gift. It is affirming the absoluteness of God
and his absolute claim.
on the human heart.
So to facilitate our exploration of Ruth Burrows' teaching on prayer,
We can categorise the various dimensions of our lives as our experience of ourselves, our experience of life as it unfolds,
and our experience of silent prayer.
Of course, in reality, these dimensions are profoundly interrelated. So we'll look at each of these dimensions in turn, focusing on Burrows' insight that what we experience as powerlessness and problematic in each of these areas
is in fact potential for transformation.
if only we had the eyes to see. So we'll turn first to our experience of ourselves.
What we're looking at here
Is how we are to respond
when
in one way or another
we're faced with the reality of our broken selves,
our mixed motivations, our unkind, twisted reactions, our inexorable self-absorption, our immovable pride, and so on. What are we to do when the goodness and holiness that we thought we had worked so hard on cultivating disappear in a puff of smoke and we're left disgusted and disappointed in ourselves? Ruth Burrows writes, we have a fundamental choice. Will I let Jesus be my holiness?
and stand in the blazing truth?
Or will I insist on having a holiness of my own, to offer him, of course, to be pleasing in his eyes? She goes on to declare, the whole essence of the Christian demand is to let God be our God and refuse to be God to ourselves. It consists fundamentally in a total acceptance of the bitter experience of our poverty and an obstinate refusal to evade it. To accept to stand in very deed and not just in pious imagination, stripped before the living God,
Our leprosy laid bare,
crippled in limb, blind, deaf, dumb, a living need. Now, of course, Ruth Burrows isn't advocating a turn to complacency or fatalism. She's simply saying that our Christian living has to be imbued with the truth that we cannot climb to heaven by our own efforts. As she says in another place,
from the shelter of the Son's heart, we go on trying with him to do always what pleases the Father,
but at the same time never wanting to feel we are becoming holy and good without spot or wrinkle.
Never are we more truly in Christ Jesus
Than when,
deeply conscious of our sinfulness, we peacefully rest
in the heart of our Redeemer. Yeah. You might want to hold on to your seats for a second. Burrows says many times throughout her writings that fleeing from our inherent poverty and taking refuge in self-manufactured holiness is a chief stumbling block.
is the chief stumbling block on the spiritual journey.
And
She highlights the dreadful irony
that it's the so-called religious professionals who are more likely to hide behind the shield of their spiritual achievements
rather than surrender to God in the midst of their messy poverty and brokenness.
I'm afraid that she's talking about people like us.
Yeah.
And it's a very sobering insight. Do we dare contemplate whether it could be true of us personally
That we prefer to cultivate a bulletproof spiritual image rather than face the truth of being a loved sinner who will never not be in need of grace?
She writes,
Only too easily we substitute the spiritual life or the contemplative life for God.
without realising it, we are intent on a self-culture.
The proof is that when God would take this out of our hands
and ask us to begin to live for him and not for our spiritual satisfaction,
we refuse. A priest might have devoted himself
to work for the poor. Everyone praises him for his selfless dedication. Nothing is too much trouble, nothing too irksome.
Then,
Perhaps he is asked to take charge of a well-to-do, stick-in-the-mud parish, and he objects. The reasons brought forward will be
edifying because he must convince himself that he is a man of God. But the real reason is that to work in such a parish will rob him of his sense of doing something worthwhile, something heroic.
It would be a spiritual come-down and would tarnish his image of himself. It may be precisely in the non-glamorous situation of an ordinary middle-class atmosphere that the greatest generosity is called for, but probably it won't feel like generosity. Let's move on now to continue our exploration of Ruth Burrows' teaching on prayer, this all-encompassing reality, by looking at our experience of life as it unfolds. What we're focusing on here is the way in which we are to respond to our fundamental and often terrifying powerlessness in the face of the circumstances and people that make up our lives. Our innate tendency is to try to assume control over the people and events that constitute our reality.
In all of their otherness and unpredictability.
We subtly try to manipulate the stream of life so that it curves in the direction of what we think will be our own fulfillment and happiness. Or we seek to control life
By relentless worrying, subconsciously convincing ourselves
that we've outfoxed reality by imagining everything that could go wrong in life.
Burrows
However, urges us
to accept
our scary powerlessness
before the unfolding of life
as precious space
for expressing great trust in the God of love.
She wants to face our vulnerability unarmored, allowing Jesus
To incarnate within our lives his infallible living knowledge that we are loved and that all is ultimately well.
So to our fervent attempts to stage manage every event of life and all the people in it, Burrows says this: in surrendering to life as it unfolds,
No matter what it offers, in exposing ourselves to it,
evading, not fantasizing, not subtly,
half consciously, if not consciously,
seeing things we don't want and warding them off.
protecting ourselves and trying to control life.
In all of this, we're surrendered to the Father.
We must live with intense faith.
And to our anxious attempts to control life by fretting and catastrophizing, she says this: there is only one point, so to speak, where God is for us.
And that is
Now. How readily we would escape from the now into what we think should be, to what may be,
what has been,
what is coming. How much energy and attention we waste worrying over the past, being anxious and doubtful and full of fear for the future. Can't go on like this.
I can't cope with this day after day.
If I surrender to God, there is no knowing what will be asked, etc., etc.
All that is unreal. God isn't in it
He is with me
now.
quietly, unobtrusively, asking me to receive him
To recognize him
now.
in this one little circumscribed moment, I can say yes.
Oh, how simple it is, that poor little yes in the now. Not in the future, not even an hour ahead, but now.
And yet it is all that is required for God to give himself entirely.
This
Is to live in Jesus' sonship.
total dependency, our whole life affirming, you are my Father. Of course, there's no suggestion here that Burrows is advocating that we submissively accept abuse or passively condone injustice or anything of the sort. Such things are inimical to living in the spirit of Jesus. Rather, she is saying that as much as we want to armour up and to control life,
Through our own interior resources,
if we allow Jesus to express his trusting yes to God through our powerlessness before life, we're opening ourselves to all the divine strength and love that are being poured out to help us face what life sets before us. We come now to our experience of silent prayer. As I've mentioned several times, throughout this presentation, we're looking at prayer with a wide-angle lens. It's our relationship with the God of love as that relationship unfolds in every dimension of our lives. And now we're focusing on that aspect of that relationship, one aspect of that relationship, our time given to silent prayer. Burrows' central insight here is that prayer is essentially what God does in us
and not what we do. Silent prayer is about coming before our God of never-ending, self-squandering love.
In a spirit of resolute receptivity, trusting that God is at work in our depths, transforming us and taking his holy joy in us. Our times of silent prayer
are about being held by the Holy Spirit in Jesus' yes
to the Father's outpoured love. So the emphasis is on openness.
Emptiness.
It's not on achievement.
Producing or impressing.
Burrows offers a helpful summary of this essence of silent prayer
in a letter to her friend, the diplomat Mark Allen.
She writes,
"Our work
is to believe,
and as far as we can,
maintain the faith attitude. I know I am in your loving presence. Please work in me as you want. Give me yourself, which is what you want to do." We will have to keep fueling that faith, redirecting ourselves if we've wandered off.
Reaffirm our belief if we get discouraged and so forth and so forth. It is a sort of non-passive passivity, a quiet reaching out, a longing, and of course a self-surrender.
In effect, we are saying, here I am,
Helpless.
You must do everything for me. And that is the simple, unassailable truth. We cannot rise to God, cannot raise ourselves upwards.
God comes to us and lifts us up.
So Burrows speaks there of cultivating a non-passive passivity. Her point here is that
while the fundamental disposition we're to bring to silent prayer is receptivity,
our depths exposed to the inundation of God's love,
we need to work at sustaining that receptivity.
Our openness generally needs some kind of scaffolding.
And it's precisely in this context
that Burrows understands the role of the various methods of prayer, praying with the scriptures, Christian meditation, praying the rosary, and so on. She sees all these prayer forms
as ways of keeping our deepest being
exposed to God's love.
In her words, we use various ways of praying
precisely to enable us to affirm and reaffirm our faith in God's presence to us in love.
And in his work of love in us.
So what's implied here is that whatever we happen to do during our times of silent prayer isn't an end in itself. Our various ways of praying are not meant to be techniques that we're trying to get really good at, or ways of leading us to spiritual success and enlightenment, or little performances that we put on for God. As Burrows puts it, our various methods of praying must be used with a light touch
and not become a screen behind which we hide our spiritual impotence.
Their purpose must be to help us to maintain our undefended aloneness before our God.
That image I've got there might need a little bit of
interpreting. Seeing the fire as representing the fire of God's love, the wood as representing us, create them there to be loved, to catch on fire.
And the tongs there as various methods,
various ways of praying. So the different ways of praying.
simply hold our deepest self in the fire of God's love.
Now, this may all be sounding so far so good.
The rub in Ruth Burrows' teaching on silent prayer
Comes from her insight that on the whole,
we don't consistently live from the truth that prayer is essentially what God does in us and not what we do.
the litmus test is how we respond when we experience barrenness,
Blankness
nothingness.
during our times of prayer.
What do we do when nothing seems to be happening, when we're getting no returns for the time that we're putting into prayer? Throughout her writings, Burrows points out that our natural tendency
Is to assume that our feelings are an accurate and reliable indicator of the truth of things. And this includes our feelings about what is happening in our times of silent prayer.
So when our prayer gives us nothing but nothingness and boredom, we're only too quick to assume that,
We're somehow doing it wrong.
and so we look for ways of praying that are more satisfying and that they assure us that we're doing it right. Or we give up praying altogether, thinking I was a complete dud at that, maybe I'll be better at a soup kitchen. Burrows is relentlessly insistent
That our feelings are no indicator.
of the truth and reality of our prayer.
Such a relief.
If prayer is essentially divine,
If prayer is the Holy Spirit
holding us in Jesus' yes to the Father's outpoured love,
then the reality of prayer
simply cannot be registered
by our finite human capacities.
The fruits of our silent prayer will certainly show up in the fabric of our daily lives, as more and more it's the case that it's no longer the egocentric I that lives, but it's the self-emptying Christ that lives in me. But this divine transformation that's happening in prayer simply can't be grasped by our human faculties. So there's absolutely no justification, she teaches, for our presuming that we're spiritual failures, or that we've been forgotten by God, or that we're not doing it right,
If we experience silent prayer
as dry, boring, and ineffective. The times of silent prayer give us nothing but nothingness. Burrows urges us to persevere with trust and to refuse to be discouraged. Now, as with all of her exhortations to trust in the face of our poverty, she's not speaking about some grim
determination.
Rather, she's saying that in steadfastly holding out empty hands to God in prayer, through thick and thin,
No matter what we feel,
we are sharing in Jesus' self-emptying surrender to the living God.
day after day,
We are divinely enabled to say our little yes in the darkness, if darkness is our experience.
in Burrows' words, day after day,
We are being summoned to the espousals of the cross.
let me finish off this section with another piece from Ruth Burrows' letter to that diplomat, Mark Allen. She writes, "We have Jesus' own words that we must go on praying and never give up, though seemingly ignored.
I find this such a moving story, the importunate widow and the unjust judge. Jesus knew that his loving Father can seem unjust,
Obdurate, indifferent to us,
and gives us no reward for our devotion.
Don't take any notice of what it seems like,
I know the reality.
is what he is saying. Just go on.
Ask, and you will receive. Seek, and you will find.
Knock, and the door will be opened.
Do we really believe this?
We must put all our weight on Jesus' words and end our worries and concern as to whether we've got it right.
Am I using the right knocker, or is there another one I haven't seen?
We can be far more occupied with the way we are knocking and asking than with the heart of God.
I first met Ruth Burrows, Sister Rachel Gregory, in 2009.
And after that encounter,
I wrote in my prayer journal, she has become fire.
and what I had in mind was a story from the Desert Fathers that may well be familiar to you.
It goes like this. Abba Lot went to visit Abba Joseph and said to him,
Abba, as far as I can, I say my little office. I fast a little, pray and meditate.
I live in peace as far as I can. I purify my thoughts. What else can I do? Then the old man stood up.
Stretched out his hands towards heaven.
His fingers became like 10 torches of flame, and he said,
Why not become fire?
I'd never before met someone both so fully themselves and so alive.
With the life of Christ.
Those two things go together. What Ruth embodied in her life
Is what she offers us in her teaching on prayer.
Her teaching on prayer is about allowing the Holy Spirit to incarnate within every corner of our lives Jesus' complete receptivity to the Father's love.
It has at its heart what St. Elizabeth of the Trinity wrote in her prayer to the Holy Trinity.
O consuming fire, Spirit of love,
Come upon me.
and create in my soul a kind of incarnation of the Word, that I may be another humanity to him, in which he can renew his whole mystery.
And as you've seen, the key to this transformation
Is recognizing and accepting
our inherent human poverty
as the way to being plunged into Trinitarian depths.
as we've seen throughout this presentation.
It's through all our various manifestations of unsuccessfulness, not enoughness, and fragility
That Jesus opens us out
to the God of love.
if only we accept
This raw poverty of our existence with loving trust. So what Ruth Burrows teaches us is that the way to becoming fully alive, to becoming the loved, free, joyful creatures that we were created to be, is paved with very stones that our pride would rather reject. In her introduction to Interior Castle Explored, this is what Burrows says about Teresa of Avila. Here is a woman who surely knows. She isn't merely speculating, deducing. She isn't relying on what others have said. Here is one with a well of living knowledge within her.
And it is from this she's drawing all the time.
And of course, this is a marvellous and accurate description of our beloved Saint Teresa of Avila. And surely,
Ruth Burrows herself also rises before our eyes as we hear this description. Here is a woman who surely knows.
here is one with a well of living knowledge within her from which she drew all the time.
So is Ruth Burrows a St. Teresa of Avila of our times? I think Father Stephen Sonberg is absolutely spot on. Thank you.
very wonderful talk. And
I think we have a few moments for questions or comments. So would anybody like to ask a question or have a comment? Raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you. Yes.
Thank you very much for really wonderful reflection. I'd like to go back to this relationship perhaps between Ruth Burrows and Teresa of Avila and ask what you think Teresa would see of herself in Ruth and Ruth's experience. Yeah.
What would Saint Teresa see of herself in Ruth Burrows?
She would not see herself in some
Fundamental dimensions in terms of Ruth's relenting darkness and aridity.
but she would see herself in her absolute captivation with the person of Jesus and with her determination to do everything that it takes.
To let Jesus be the way, the truth, and the life in her, for her, with her. I think she would also see her own love for the scriptures embodied in Sister Rachel, in Ruth Burrows. In her very earliest days, Ruth was immersed in the scriptures, and that's what made sense of her own experience.
For her and what made sense of the Carmelite tradition for her.
I think Saint Teresa would find a kindredness in that as well. A few ideas.
Wondering what you thought of something, and it's kind of slipping my mind now. But I think maybe it'll come to me. If someone else has a thought, it'll come back in my thoughts. But if there's anyone else, and maybe it'll come back. Sorry about that.
We understand.
Purification of that.
That's right.
Thank you very much. What intrigues me, and I don't know if you ever discussed this with her, she talked about the messiness of sinfulness, this being the place where we meet God. Okay. What would she, as an enclosed nun, determine to be her sinfulness?
You want to do two questions? No. Hold that thought.
So what would she, as an enclosed nun, see to be her sinfulness?
You know what? I think it's the same as the rest of us. The relentless ensnarement of the ego, in all the different ways that it expresses itself. So she talks about her unkind thoughts, her mixed motivations, her desire to impress, her critical assessments of, I know that none of you Whitefriars would be doing this, but her critical assessments of those with whom she lived in community. But, those same things are shown in family life, in different expressions of lay life. So, and she says that
even if she couldn't put a hand up for what might be classified in traditional moral theology as mortal sins, but any degree of turning away from
what she knows Jesus wanted of her and taking recourse in the ego, she saw as significant,
So my thought was that I think it's Interior Castle Explored, where she is willing to criticize or challenge and say that Teresa got it wrong, but not because she was bad, but just because she didn't know what we know, or we've progressed our thoughts, our psychology. So and at some point I had read, I don't know where this was, that she felt that all the traditions could do that to their founders, or to the Jesuits, the St. Ignatius, the Franciscans, St. Francis, that we needed to pull the mask off of them. So I'm wondering, what are the steps? How do you do that? Because she did it so lovingly, and yet she was able to say this is where she had it wrong.
Yeah, she talks about pulling the veil off. It might have been in Stephen Sondberg's obituary that she
That's chosen. I don't really know. Maybe by having the courage, members of different religious orders having the courage to say where they thought that their founder might have been limited by their historical, spiritual context. I think it's
having that courage and not being afraid to use contemporary research and to use that to draw out possible limitations. So
that's a great question.
Have a question?
Maybe one more question after that, and then we can get to the clues.
Well, Teresa of Avila spoke a lot about prayer leading to love, that was the end point. And I just wondered, in your research on Ruth Burrows, did she have struggles in community and communal life? I just wondered if you had anything to say about that.
Yes, she did. Especially in her early days, she entered into a very dysfunctional Carmelite community where there'd been a foundation and there was just lots of really bad dynamics. And even on her retreat before her final profession, supposed to have a spiritual conversation each day with the prioress, and it was just bad-mouthing all the prioress was just bagging out all the other nuns. It wasn't good. But when Sister Rachel became prioress at Quiddenham, her first priority was to make the sisters feel loved.
And it's just so beautiful. I was saying to someone earlier today to visit Quiddenham and to see these wonderful women who were
so fully themselves, so fully open to exploring and developing their gifts within the limits of the rule. This flourishing of what Teresa talked about, of everyone knowing that they're loved and everyone belonging, So yeah, she experienced dysfunction and difficulty, and it was one of the things that she really tried to reform as she implemented the directives of the Second Vatican Council.
More? Yes.
Thank you first for the good presentation. Ruth, she has negated the issue of having distractions in prayer, something which seemed to be talked by many of the saints. I don't know how she understands about distractions, and especially when they come from the devil. We have seen many saints in their saint life having an experience with the devil. Let me say that. I don't know if she touches anything to do with that. Think that devil can be part of prayer and distraction.
Thank you for that question.
She certainly talks about distractions
in prayer. In fact, in her book Essence of Prayer, there's a short chapter about distractions in prayer.
As to whether she talks about the devil's
work in bringing about distraction, I can't recall. We have a
Ruth scholar in the room. Can you think of anything, Lisa?
No, that. So I'm not. She certainly talks about the devil in other contexts, but I don't know about in terms of distraction. But in terms of distractions in prayer in general, she would want us to have a light touch and not to be obsessed or worried, but just to come back to that receptivity and to use whatever method we might be using to hold us in that openness to God's love. Because the minute we start fretting about our distractions, in that moment it then becomes about us, and what we're doing in prayer and what we're achieving. But we can use these distractions as just a chance to come back and express our fundamental attitude of receptivity.
One more from the chat, from our online viewers. The question is, can you share any personal memories from the time that you spent with her in person?
Which memories to share?
I'll share too.
Just to watch her in prayer was
such a blessing, because I could see her
focus and this receptivity and everything that we've
heard really lived out, just to watch her as she prayed the office. And so that intensity of focus was a great something to behold. But I remember in one of our conversations, I
was telling her how
one day at Mass, I was looking around at everyone else and thinking, I think I'm the most humble person in the room. And what I loved was that I could share that with her in the first place, that she was so fully herself, so fully God, that I felt so safe with her that I could share my own frailties with her, and the way that we could laugh about it and say, yes, aren't we silly billies, and to recognize that how the ego tries to assert itself in all these contexts, and not to get dismayed, but to come back and say, Lord,
without your yes within this, another little dimension of my poverty that I've discovered in this thought.
So just, having the freedom to be totally myself with her in lots of other ways as well, but in that instant, totally myself, and that we can smile at these things and not be
worried about ourselves, but just keep bringing ourselves back to that receptivity.
So again, let's give a round of applause to our. I think it says something about the Carmelite tradition that,
Got somebody from the other side of the world to come here to Washington to talk about a Carmelite in the UK who has a message for us today, and that Carmel is not just about St. Teresa in the past or John of the Cross or even Therese closer to our time, but somebody who is a contemporary of ours. And I hope we can continue to have lectures like this. And when you finish your book on Wendy Beckett and you're doing your book tour, try to make a stop in the U.S. again so we can hear about that too. So thank you so much for coming this year, and we're very happy to have you at this annual lecture in Carmelite Studies.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.